When a billionaire's world crumbles in 30 seconds, sometimes the person who saves everything is the one he never bothered to see. In that moment of pure terror, status means nothing. Only skill matters. In the grand ballroom of the Meridian estate, Diane moves quietly, efficiently, her white serving apron pristine against the marble floors that cost more than most people's homes. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows as she refills champagne glasses like clockwork. Every 15 minutes, invisible to the guests who discuss million-dollar deals between bites of caviar. No one knows she once held lives in her hands in sterile hospital rooms. No one even notices how her eyes automatically assess the elderly gentleman's labored breathing at table 12, or how she subtly adjusts the positioning of the diabetic guest's water glass closer to his medication. But when tech billionaire Marcus Hamilton's 8-year-old daughter, Emma, suddenly collapses during the wedding reception, her small body convulsing violently on the Italian marble floor, Diane doesn't hesitate. She observes the panicked crowd, the useless shouting, the precious seconds ticking away. What they didn't know was that those hands serving their champagne had once performed emergency procedures in trauma centers across 3 states. And with just one look at the child's symptoms, she was about to make a decision that would expose everything she'd tried to leave behind. Because sometimes the person who saves your world is the one you've spent years looking right through. The wedding of Hamilton Industries. CFO was supposed to be perfect. 500 of the city's most influential people gathered under hand-painted ceilings, where each floral arrangement cost more than most monthly salaries. The bride's dress alone had been featured in 3 magazines, and the guest list read like a Forbes 500 directory. Diane had been working events like these for 2 years now, ever since she'd traded her scrubs for serving uniforms. She knew exactly how to become invisible, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes downcast but observant, movements swift but never drawing attention. The wealthy liked their help to blend into the background like expensive wallpaper. Marcus Hamilton commanded attention even in this room full of power players. At 34, his tech empire had revolutionized data security for Fortune 500 companies. His charcoal Tom Ford suit probably cost more than Diane made in 3 months, and his presence seemed to bend conversations toward him like a gravitational field. His daughter, Emma, a miniature version of her father's confidence, wore a powder blue dress that complemented her bright eyes as she charmed the adults around her father's table. Diane had served their table 4 times already. Marcus never looked at her, not unusual for someone of his stature. She was part of the scenery, like the gold-leafed columns or the orchestral quartet. Even when she'd quietly moved Emma's chair slightly away from the table edge after noticing the child's habit of leaning back dangerously, neither father nor daughter acknowledged her presence. The evening flowed like clockwork until 8:47 p.m. Diane was approaching table 6, with a fresh bottle of Dom Perignon when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze, a sharp, distinctive cry followed by the unmistakable thud of a small body hitting marble. Emma Hamilton lay on the floor, her powder blue dress a stark contrast against the white marble as her body seized violently. The convulsions were rhythmic, severe, and her lips were already beginning to show the telltale blue tinge of oxygen deprivation. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Women in designer gowns backed away in horror, their hands pressed to their mouths. Men in $1,000 suits stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or retreat. Someone screamed for a doctor. Someone else was frantically dialing 911. Marcus Hamilton dropped to his knees beside his daughter, his usual composure shattered. Emma, baby, talk to Daddy." His voice cracked with a terror that no amount of wealth could shield him from. But Diane had already set down the champagne bottle and was moving through the crowd with purpose, her trained eye taking in every detail of Emma's condition. The way the child's back arched, the duration of the seizure already pushing past 2 minutes. The slight foam at the corner of her mouth. She dropped to her knees beside the terrified billionaire, her hands automatically checking Emma's pulse and airway. "Sir, I need you to move back just a little," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Marcus looked up at her for the first time all evening, his eyes wild with panic. "Who are you? Are you a doctor?" For just a moment Diane hesitated. Then she looked back at Emma's convulsing form and made her choice. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button. We share incredible stories of overlooked heroes every week. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us about a time you witnessed hidden talent being dismissed. Your stories matter and they inspire our next videos. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, serving our tables, cleaning our offices, working quietly in roles that make them invisible. But when crisis strikes, character reveals itself. What hidden talents are walking among us right now, unrecognized and undervalued? Share your thoughts below. Diane Mitchell had worked at Prestige Catering for 26 months, serving at events she could never afford to attend as a guest. At 32, she moved through luxury venues with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to make herself small, unremarkable, forgettable. The Meridian estate staff walked by her as if she were expensive furniture, necessary but unworthy of attention. She served senators who debated healthcare policy while never asking her opinion, tech executives who discussed innovation while ignoring the innovative mind refilling their water glasses. But Diane watched. She always watched. Her eagle eyes automatically cataloged medical details others missed. The pharmaceutical executive's slight hand tremor suggesting early Parkinson's, the ambassador's wife's labored breathing indicating possible heart issues, the young socialite's telltale signs of an eating disorder. Old habits died hard, and medical training never really left your bones. On that particular evening, Diane had noticed Emma Hamilton immediately. The 8-year-old was charming and precocious, but there were subtle signs that made Diane's medical instincts twitch. The child rubbed her temples twice during dinner. She complained once about the lights being too bright. Her father, engrossed in business conversations, missed these warning signs entirely. When Emma had asked for a second glass of orange juice, Diane heard her speech pattern, just slightly slurred, barely noticeable unless you knew what to listen for. She'd positioned herself closer to the Hamilton table after that, instinctively preparing for something she hoped wouldn't happen. The moment Emma collapsed, Diane heard something that made her heart race with recognition. "She's having a seizure," Marcus shouted to the crowd.
"Someone call 911.
"Where's a doctor?" Those words weren't foreign to her. For 7 years, she had been the doctor people called for. She moved closer, her trained eye immediately assessing the situation. Emma's seizure was tonic-clonic, what used to be called grand mal. The rhythmic jerking, the loss of consciousness, the way her head had turned to one side. Classic presentation, but in a child this young, it could indicate something serious. "Sir, I can help," she said quietly, kneeling beside Marcus. His response came with a dismissive wave. "Just get back. We need medical professionals here." You wouldn't understand. But deep inside, something had stirred in Diane. This wasn't just a serving uniform she wore. Underneath it beat the heart of someone who had saved lives, who had stood in trauma bays making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She had been Dr. Diane Mitchell once. She had completed her emergency medicine residency at Johns Hopkins. She had worked trauma centers in Baltimore, Chicago, and Atlanta. Her hands had sutured wounds, intubated patients, and performed CPR on children just like Emma. But Marcus Hamilton didn't know that. To him, she was just the help. The seizure continued, now approaching the 3-minute mark, the point where permanent brain damage became a real concern. Emma's oxygen saturation was dropping. Her lips were turning blue. Diane made a decision that would change everything. She ignored Marcus's dismissal and focused entirely on Emma. "Emma, honey, it's going to be okay," she whispered, checking the child's airway and positioning her properly to prevent aspiration. Her movements were automatic, muscle memory from thousands of emergency situations. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded, but his voice carried less authority now, colored by the desperation of a father watching his daughter suffer. "Keeping her safe until the paramedics arrive," Diane replied, never taking her eyes off Emma. She was monitoring the seizure duration, watching for signs of status epilepticus, preparing to take more aggressive action if necessary. Someone in the crowd shouted, "The ambulance is still 15 minutes away. Traffic is blocked by some accident on 5th Avenue. 15 minutes. In pediatric seizures lasting this long, 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. That's when Diane knew she had to make a choice. She could maintain her invisible status, wait for the paramedics, and hope Emma would be okay. Or she could do what she was trained to do, reveal who she really was, and accept whatever consequences came with stepping out of the shadows. She looked at Emma's face, now pale and still convulsing, then at Marcus's terrified expression. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not her carefully constructed new life. Not her reasons for leaving medicine behind. Not the shocked stares of 500 wealthy guests. Only Emma mattered. "Sir, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she hadn't used in over 2 years. "Your daughter is having a prolonged seizure. The longer it continues, the more dangerous it becomes. I have experience with this and I need to help her now." Marcus stared at her, confusion and fear warring in his eyes. "Experience? You're a waitress." "Right now I'm the person who's going to save your daughter's life," Diane replied quietly. "But I need you to trust me." For the first time all evening, Marcus really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. What he saw in her steady brown eyes wasn't the deference of a service worker, but the calm confidence of someone who had stood in far worse situations and emerged victorious. The seizure was now at 4 minutes and counting. Emma's color was getting worse. Time was running out. 5 minutes later, the crowd of elegant guests still lingered in a confused semicircle around Emma's small form, their cocktail conversations forgotten as they witnessed something far more real than any business deal. Voices grew sharper with panic as the seizure showed no signs of stopping. "Where's that ambulance?" demanded someone from the crowd. "This is taking too long. She needs a hospital immediately," called out Dr. Richardson, a plastic surgeon who specialized in celebrity facelifts rather than emergency medicine, his expertise useless in this moment. Marcus knelt beside his daughter, his $3,000 suit forgotten as he held Emma's hand, whispering desperate encouragements. "Hold on, baby girl. Daddy's here. Help is coming." Without thinking, Diane spoke up with the authority that had once commanded trauma teams. "She needs intravenous anticonvulsants now. At this duration, we're looking at potential status epilepticus, which can cause permanent neurological damage." Dead silence fell over the crowd. 50 pairs of eyes turned to her with expressions ranging from confusion to surprise. The woman in the server's uniform was using medical terminology that half the room didn't understand. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "What did you just say?" Diane felt heat creep up her neck as she realized her mistake. She'd broken character completely, speaking like the doctor she used to be rather than the invisible server she was supposed to be. Dr. Richardson stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sorry, miss, but medical decisions should be left to actual medical professionals. Perhaps you could help by getting us some towels." The dismissal stung, but not as much as watching Emma's continued distress. Diane had seen too many cases where professional pride and protocol had cost precious minutes. Minutes that could mean the difference between a child walking out of a hospital or being wheeled out in a very different condition, of course. "Doctor," she said quietly, but made no move to leave Emma's side. Her trained eye continued monitoring the child's condition, noting the subtle changes that indicated the seizure was beginning to shift into something more dangerous. Marcus studied Diane with new interest, his business instincts picking up on something he'd missed before. "Wait, how do you know about, what did you call it? Status epilepticus?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the beautiful people of high society waited for her answer, some with curious expressions, others with the barely concealed disdain of those who believed knowledge was distributed according to social hierarchy. Diane looked down at Emma, whose small body continued its rhythmic convulsions despite being 6 minutes into the episode. The child's fingernails were taking on a blue tinge that made Diane's stomach clench with professional alarm. She began, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell this room full of people who saw her as nothing more than hired help that she had once been their equal, no, their superior, in the very skill they now desperately needed? "She probably watched some medical show on TV," scoffed a woman in a diamond-encrusted gown. "Everyone thinks they're an expert these days." Dr. Richardson nodded patronizingly. "The internet has made everyone believe they understand medicine. Very dangerous thinking, actually." But Marcus wasn't listening to them. His intense gaze remained fixed on Diane, and she could see the wheels turning in his brilliant business mind. He was a man who had built an empire by recognizing value where others saw none, by identifying talent that others overlooked. "You didn't learn about status epilepticus from TV," he said slowly. Those weren't layman's terms. You spoke like someone who's seen it before, Diane finished quietly. The admission seemed to electrify the space between them. Emma's seizure continued, now at 7 minutes, well beyond the point where any parent would remain calm. How many times? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How many times have you seen this before? Diane met his eyes directly for the first time since she'd knelt beside Emma. More than I can count. The truth settled over the crowd like a blanket, muffling the ambient noise of the reception. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, their music seeming inappropriate for the medical emergency unfolding on the marble dance floor. Dr. Richardson stepped forward again, his professional ego clearly threatened. Mr. Hamilton, I really must insist that we wait for proper emergency medical services. This young woman, regardless of whatever online research she may have done, is not qualified to. Emma's oxygen saturation is dropping dangerously low, Diane interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had delivered similar assessments to worried families countless times. Her color is getting worse, and we're now at 7.5 minutes of continuous seizure activity. Standard protocol calls for immediate intervention at this point. Marcus stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching awe. Standard protocol according to whom? Diane walked away from the crowd, but this time it wasn't embarrassment driving her retreat. This time she was making a strategic decision, the kind she'd made 1,000 times in emergency departments when politics and protocol threatened patient care. She moved to her small service station at the edge of the ballroom, where the catering staff kept their supplies. From her purse, the one item she was allowed to keep personal, she withdrew something that made several guests gasp in recognition. It was small, silver, and unmistakable to anyone who had ever been in a medical setting, a stethoscope. But this wasn't just any stethoscope. Engraved on the chest piece were the words that would change everything. Dr. D. Mitchell, Emergency Medicine, Johns Hopkins Hospital. She walked back to Emma with steady, purposeful steps, the medical instrument hanging around her neck transforming her entire presence. The servile posture was gone, replaced by the confident bearing of someone who belonged in a trauma bay. That wasn't just embarrassment she'd felt at Dr. Richardson's dismissal. That was righteous indignation finally waking up. In her modest one-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, Diane sat with a leather-bound journal that had once been her most prized possession. The building was nothing like the Meridian estate. No marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, just honest working-class housing where the rent was affordable and the neighbors knew each other's names. On the journal's worn cover, gold lettering spelled out Johns Hopkins Emergency Medicine Residency Program. The pages were filled with case notes, research observations, and the careful documentation of a young doctor determined to save every life that came through her trauma bay doors. Back then, medical terminology was her native language. She had spoken fluently of Glasgow coma scales and pediatric dosing calculations, of differential diagnoses and treatment protocols. She had been Dr. Diane Mitchell, emergency medicine physician, and she had been brilliant at it. The journal fell open to a page dated 3 years earlier. Case Nr. 4847, 8-year-old male, witness seizure onset, duration 12 minutes upon arrival, status epilepticus, administered lorazepam 0.1 mg IV, followed by phenytoin loading dose. Patient stabilized, full neurological recovery, discharged home day 3 with new seizure medication regimen. Her handwriting was confident, precise. The handwriting of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. The last entry in the journal was different. Her usually neat script was shaky, emotional. I can't do this anymore. Every child I see is Michael. Every parent's tears are mine. I have to walk away before I break completely. Michael. Her 4-year-old nephew, her sister's firstborn, the little boy who called her Aunt Didi and wanted to be a doctor just like her when he grew up. The child she hadn't been able to save when it mattered most. The night Michael died, Diane had been working a double shift at Chicago General, treating other people's children while her own family faced their worst nightmare. Rachel had called her sobbing, barely coherent. Di, he's burning up with fever, he's confused, he won't wake up properly. Bring him to my hospital, Diane had said immediately. I'll meet you in the emergency department. But Rachel lived an hour away and Michael couldn't wait an hour. By the time the local paramedics reached him, Bacterial meningitis had already begun its devastating work. By the time he reached a hospital, the damage was irreversible. Diane had flown home to Detroit immediately, still wearing her scrubs, still carrying the stethoscope that now lay on her coffee table, like an artifact from another life. She had held Michael's small hand as machines kept his body functioning while his brain slowly died. She had been there when Rachel and David made the impossible decision to let their son go. At the funeral, Rachel had looked at her with eyes empty of everything except grief. "You save everyone else's children," she had whispered. "Why couldn't you save mine?" The question had shattered something in Diane that never quite healed. She knew Rachel hadn't meant it cruelly. Grief made people say things they didn't mean. But the words echoed in every emergency room thereafter. Every pediatric case became Michael. Every frightened parent became Rachel. Every moment of helplessness became magnified until she could barely function. 6 months after Michael's funeral, Dr. Diane Mitchell had submitted her resignation letter to Chicago General. She had packed her medical textbooks, hung up her stethoscope, and disappeared from the medical world entirely. For 2 years, she had been running from who she used to be. She had changed cities, changed careers, changed everything about her life except the knowledge that remained locked in her mind and the reflexes that remained embedded in her hands. But watching Emma Hamilton convulse on that marble floor, seeing Marcus's terrified face, hearing the inadequate responses from people who should have known better, it all came rushing back. She hadn't left medicine because she wasn't good at it. She had left because she was too good at it, because she cared too much, because the weight of responsibility had nearly crushed her. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just a grieving aunt watching her nephew slip away, while bureaucracy and distance prevented her from helping. This time she was right there with the skills and knowledge needed to make a difference. Diane picked up her stethoscope, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. The metal was cool, solid, real. For the first time in 2 years, holding it didn't bring pain. It brought purpose. She thought about Emma, about Marcus's desperate eyes, about all the medical emergencies she had watched from the sidelines while wearing a server's uniform and keeping her mouth shut. How many times had she bitten her tongue while watching inadequate first aid or delayed responses? How many times had she forced herself to remember that she was just the help now? But tonight had changed something fundamental. When she saw Emma in distress, every instinct she had developed over years of emergency medicine training had screamed at her to act. And when she had finally listened to those instincts, when she had spoken with medical authority instead of servile deference, she had felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael's death. She had felt like herself again. Diane stood up from her couch, journal in one hand, stethoscope in the other. In the mirror across the room, she could see her reflection, no longer the hunched, invisible service worker, but the confident physician she had trained to be. "I didn't leave medicine," she said quietly to her reflection. "Medicine never left me. I just had to walk away for a while to heal." She looked down at the stethoscope again, at the engraving that proclaimed her identity. Tomorrow she would have to face whatever consequences came from revealing herself at the Meridian estate. Marcus Hamilton would have questions. Her catering company would probably fire her. The careful anonymity she had built would be shattered. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Dr. Diane Mitchell was ready to be a doctor again. In that quiet apartment, she finally saw herself not as a broken physician hiding from her past, but as a healer who had been given a second chance to do what she was born to do. Because sometimes the most important surgery you perform is on your own wounded soul. The ballroom was still, holding its collective breath when Diane returned to Emma's side, her stethoscope gleaming under the crystal chandeliers like a badge of authority she had forgotten she possessed. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. Gone was the hunched posture of the invisible server, replaced by the confident bearing of someone who had commanded trauma teams. She knelt beside Emma with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and purposeful. The child was now 9 minutes into the seizure, her small body showing dangerous signs of prolonged oxygen deprivation. Without hesitation, Diane began her assessment with the systematic precision that had once made her one of the most respected emergency physicians at Johns Hopkins. "Emma, I'm Dr. Mitchell," she said calmly, even though the child couldn't hear her. "I'm going to take care of you." Her hands moved with muscle memory as she checked Emma's airway, pulse, and breathing. The stethoscope revealed what she had suspected: irregular heart rhythm from the prolonged seizure, but strong enough to sustain life if she acted quickly. Marcus watched in stunned silence as this woman he had dismissed as mere help demonstrated medical expertise that surpassed everyone else in the room. "You're really a doctor," he whispered, the words carrying equal parts amazement and shame. "Emergency medicine. Johns Hopkins," Diane replied without taking her eyes off Emma. 7 years in trauma centers, and right now your daughter needs intravenous anticonvulsants that won't arrive with that ambulance. Dr. Richardson stepped forward, his ego still bruised. "Even if you are a physician, we don't have the proper medications here. We should wait for—" "We're not waiting," Diane cut him off with an authority that silenced the entire crowd. She reached into her small purse and withdrew something that made several guests gasp. A small emergency medical kit, the kind trauma physicians sometimes carried off duty. Inside were 2 vials of medication and a sterile syringe. "Lorazepam and midazolam," she announced. "I've carried these for 2 years, never thought I'd need them again." Marcus's eyes widened. "You've been carrying emergency medication while serving at weddings?" "Old habits," Diane said simply, drawing the medication into the syringe with hands that were rock steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Once a trauma physician, always prepared. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as she quickly located a vein in Emma's small arm. The injection was swift, professional, almost anticlimactic for something that would determine whether the child suffered permanent brain damage. "Lorazepam, 0.1 milligrams per kilogram," she announced, falling back into the clinical language that felt like coming home. "Should take effect within 60 to 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds stretched like hours. The ballroom was so quiet that the sound of Emma's labored breathing seemed amplified. Marcus held his daughter's other hand, his knuckles white with tension, his eyes never leaving Diane's face as she monitored Emma's vital signs. At exactly 73 seconds, Emma's convulsions began to slow. At 90 seconds, they stopped entirely. Her breathing deepened, her color began to return to normal, and her small body relaxed for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but Diane raised her hand for silence. "She's not out of danger yet. Post-ictal phase can be tricky in children. We need to monitor her neurological responses carefully." She began a systematic neurological assessment, checking Emma's pupils, reflexes, and response to stimuli with the thoroughness of someone who had performed thousands of similar examinations. Marcus watched every movement, his expression shifting from relief to something approaching awe. "You saved her life," he said quietly. "I did my job," Diane replied. But there was something different in her voice now. Not the humble deflection of a server, but the quiet confidence of a physician stating a simple fact. Within minutes, Emma's eyes fluttered open. She looked around in confusion, disoriented but alert. "Daddy?" she whispered. Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down his face as he gathered his daughter into his arms. "I'm here, baby girl. I'm right here." Dr. Richardson approached with considerably more respect than he had shown earlier. "Dr. Mitchell, that was exceptional work. Where did you train again?" "Johns Hopkins Emergency Medicine Residency. Fellowship in Pediatric Emergency Medicine at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia," Diane replied, her voice carrying the weight of credentials that commanded respect in any medical setting. The plastic surgeon nodded with newfound deference. "Your technique was flawless. The way you calculated the dosage, the speed of administration. You probably saved this child from permanent neurological damage." When the paramedics finally arrived, they found Emma sitting up in her father's arms, alert and responsive. Diane briefed them with the clinical precision of one professional to another, detailing the seizure duration, medications administered, and current neurological status. "Textbook intervention," the lead paramedic told her. "Perfect timing, perfect dosage. You probably saved her life." As they prepared to transport Emma to the hospital for observation, Marcus stood up and faced Diane directly. For the first time all evening, he truly saw her, not as the invisible help, but as the extraordinary physician she had always been. "Dr. Mitchell," he said formally, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology, and I owe you my daughter's life." The handshake was firm, between equals, filled with the respect that should have been there from the beginning. But the story was far from over. As Emma was wheeled out of the ballroom on a stretcher, chatting drowsily with the paramedics, 500 guests turned their attention to the woman in the server's uniform who had just performed a medical miracle. The questions began immediately. How long had she been working as catering staff? Why was a Johns Hopkins-trained physician serving champagne at weddings? What had brought her to this point? Diane looked around the ballroom at faces that now regarded her with curiosity, respect, and shame. These people who had looked through her all evening now hung on her every word. Sometimes, she said quietly, life takes you on detours you never expected. Sometimes those detours teach you things you never knew you needed to learn. She began walking toward the exit, her part in the evening's drama complete, but Marcus's voice stopped her. Dr. Mitchell, wait, please. She turned back. Unsure what to expect, we need to talk. 3 days later, Diane sat in Marcus Hamilton's downtown office, a space that commanded views of the entire city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The modern steel and glass architecture spoke of power and success, every detail carefully chosen to intimidate visitors and remind them of Hamilton Industries' dominance in the tech world. Her medical bag rested on the mahogany conference table between them, along with a folder Marcus had compiled containing information that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. You want to know who I am, she said, meeting his intense gaze directly. So I'll tell you. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the analytical mind that had built a billion-dollar empire from a college dorm room idea. I had my people do some research. Dr. Diane Mitchell graduated summa cum laude from Howard University School of Medicine. Emergency medicine residency at Johns Hopkins, top 5% of your class. Fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He opened the folder and began reading from what was obviously a detailed investigation. Published 17 peer-reviewed articles on pediatric trauma management. Received the Distinguished Physician Award from the American College of Emergency Physicians in 2021. Worked at Chicago General Hospital until... He paused, looking up at her. Until you disappeared from the medical world entirely 2 years ago. No forwarding address, no new hospital affiliation, no explanation. Diane's hands remained folded in her lap, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. You've done your homework. It's what I do. When someone saves my daughter's life, I want to know everything about them. His voice softened slightly. What I can't figure out is why one of the most promising emergency physicians in the country is serving champagne at weddings. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Diane had known this moment would come. The moment when she would have to explain the unexplainable, justify the unjustifiable. Because sometimes the weight of saving lives becomes too heavy to carry, she said quietly. Marcus frowned. What does that mean? Diane stood up and walked to the window looking out at the city below. From this height, the people looked like ants, their individual struggles invisible from such a lofty perspective. It means that 2 years ago, I failed to save the one life that mattered most to me. She told him about Michael then, about her 4-year-old nephew who had called her Aunt Di-Di. About the bacterial meningitis that had killed him while she was saving other people's children, about her sister's grief-stricken accusation that had shattered her confidence completely. I was working a double shift when he got sick, she continued, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. By the time I got to Detroit, he was already on life support. Brain dead, all my medical training, all my experience, and I couldn't save a 4-year-old boy who thought I was a superhero. Marcus listened without interruption. His business instincts recognizing the raw authenticity in her words. He had built his fortune by reading people, by understanding what motivated them, what broke them, what made them extraordinary. So you ran away, he said, not unkindly. I broke, Diane corrected. Completely. Every pediatric case became Michael. Every crying parent became my sister. I couldn't function, couldn't make decisions, couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. I had to leave before I killed someone through my incompetence. She turned back from the window to face him directly. I didn't leave medicine because I wasn't good at it. I left because I cared too much, because the responsibility was crushing me, because I couldn't separate my personal grief from my professional obligations. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. As a father, he understood the depth of love that could drive someone to such extremes. As a CEO, he recognized the kind of perfectionism that could become self-destructive. But you kept the medical bag, he observed. You kept your emergency medications current. You maintained your skills. Diane smiled sadly. You can take the doctor out of medicine, but you can't take medicine out of the doctor. I told myself I was done, but I couldn't help noticing medical signs in people around me. I couldn't stop carrying basic emergency supplies. Old habits, I suppose. Or maybe, Marcus said carefully, you were waiting for the right moment to come back. The suggestion hung between them like a possibility neither had fully articulated. Diane felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and guilt that had lived there for 2 years. When I saw Emma convulsing on that floor, she said slowly, every instinct I had ever developed screamed at me to act. For the first time since Michael died, I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess myself. I just did what I was trained to do. Marcus leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on her. And you were brilliant, flawless. You saved my daughter's life when nobody else in that room could have. I did what any competent emergency physician would have done. No, Marcus said firmly. You did what Dr. Diane Mitchell would have done. The woman who graduated at the top of her class, who published groundbreaking research, who had a gift for saving lives. That woman was still there under the server's uniform. In that quiet office high above the city, they sat in the weight of recognition. Marcus saw her now, truly saw her, not as the invisible help he had dismissed at the wedding, but as the extraordinary physician she had always been. I have a proposition for you, he said finally. Diane raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Hamilton Industries is expanding into healthcare technology. We're developing emergency response systems for schools, workplace medical protocols, telemedicine platforms for underserved communities. His voice grew more animated as he spoke, the way it always did when he talked about innovations that could change the world. We need a chief medical officer, someone who understands emergency medicine from the ground up, who has worked in trauma centers, who knows what frontline healthcare really looks like. The offer hit Diane like a physical blow. Marcus, before you say no, hear me out. This isn't about returning to clinical practice if you're not ready for that. This is about using your expertise to create systems that help other physicians save lives. Technology that could prevent tragedies like your nephew's death. For the first time in 2 years, Diane felt the stirring of something that had been dormant. Professional ambition, the desire to make a difference on a scale larger than one patient at a time. But doubt crept in immediately. I've been out of medicine for 2 years. The medical field has moved on without me. Marcus smiled. Dr. Mitchell, 3 days ago you diagnosed and treated status epilepticus in a child with perfect precision, using medications you carried in your purse just in case. The field hasn't moved on without you. You've been carrying it with you all along. 6 months later, Diane stepped into the Hamilton Industries medical research facility like she belonged there, because she finally did. The gleaming laboratory space hummed with the quiet energy of innovation, where her medical expertise was being transformed into technology that would save lives across the globe. Gone was the server's uniform, replaced by a crisp white lab coat embroidered with Dr. Diane Mitchell, Chief Medical Officer. But more than her clothing had changed, her entire bearing radiated the confidence of someone who had reclaimed not just her profession, but her sense of purpose. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after accepting Marcus's offer had been challenging, filled with imposter syndrome and the lingering fear that she wasn't ready to be a physician again. But Marcus had been patient, giving her space to rebuild her confidence while gradually increasing her responsibilities. Her first project had been developing an emergency response protocol for schools, a subject close to her, hard after witnessing too many delayed responses to medical emergencies. The system she designed would allow teachers to video conference with emergency physicians within 90 seconds of dialing for help, providing real-time medical guidance until paramedics arrived. The prototype had been tested in 50 schools across 3 states. In the first month alone, it had successfully guided teachers through managing everything from severe allergic reactions to cardiac events in teenage athletes. 2 children were alive today because teachers had received expert medical guidance in real time, rather than waiting for emergency services to arrive. But today was special. Today, Marcus was announcing the expansion of their medical technology division at a press conference attended by healthcare leaders from across the nation. And he had insisted that Diane be the one to present their latest innovation. The auditorium was packed with physicians, hospital administrators, technology executives, and members of the press. Diane recognized several faces from her medical school days, colleagues who had followed traditional career paths while she had taken her unexpected detour through catering service. As she walked onto the stage, she spotted Dr. Richardson in the third row, the plastic surgeon who had dismissed her medical expertise at the wedding. His expression showed a mixture of surprise and respect that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Marcus introduced her with pride evident in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Dr. Diane Mitchell, our Chief Medical Officer and the brilliant mind behind the innovations you're about to see." Dr. Mitchell came to us through unusual circumstances, but her expertise in emergency medicine and her unique perspective on healthcare accessibility have already saved lives. Diane stepped up to the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. 6 months ago, she had been invisible to most of these people. Now they hung on her every word. "Thank you, Marcus. 6 months ago, I was serving champagne at a wedding, when a medical emergency reminded me who I really was. Today, I want to share how that moment has led to innovations that will revolutionize emergency medical response." She clicked to her first slide, showing the school emergency response system. When seconds count, geography shouldn't determine whether a child lives or dies. Our real-time medical consultation platform has already prevented 17 potential fatalities in schools that previously had no immediate access to medical expertise. The presentation continued with their workplace medical protocol system, designed for office buildings and industrial sites. Then came their telemedicine platform for rural communities, connecting isolated patients with specialists hundreds of miles away. But the innovation she was most proud of was their pediatric seizure detection system. Wearable technology that could identify seizure onset and automatically alert emergency contacts while providing real-time guidance for bystanders. This system was inspired by an 8-year-old girl named Emma Hamilton, Diane said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Emma had a seizure that lasted over 9 minutes before receiving proper medical intervention. With our detection system, her parents would have received an alert within 30 seconds, and anyone nearby would have had access to step-by-step medical guidance through our app. When she finished her presentation, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. But more importantly, she could see the respect in the eyes of her peers, the recognition that she wasn't just a doctor who had taken an unusual path, but an innovator who was changing the future of emergency medical care. During the reception afterward, Dr. Richardson approached her with a humility that was completely different from his attitude at the wedding. "Dr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. At the Meridian Estate, I judged you based on your uniform rather than your expertise. It was unprofessional and wrong." Diane smiled graciously. "We all make assumptions sometimes, Dr. Richardson. What matters is that we learn from them. Your work here is remarkable. The pediatric seizure detection system alone will save thousands of lives. I hope you know that your contributions to emergency medicine are already legendary in our field." As the evening wound down, Marcus found her on the balcony overlooking the city. The same view she had contemplated from his office 6 months earlier. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Different," Diane admitted. "For 2 years, I defined myself by what I had lost: my nephew, my confidence, my career. Tonight I realized I've been thinking about it all wrong." She turned to face him. "I didn't lose my medical career. I gained perspective that makes me a better physician. I understand now what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have your expertise questioned because of how you look or where you work." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That perspective is exactly why your innovations are so revolutionary. You design systems that serve everyone, not just the wealthy or well-connected." "Every morning I still think about Michael," Diane continued. "But now, instead of the thought paralyzing me, it motivates me. Every system we build, every protocol we design, every life we save, it honors his memory by ensuring other families don't suffer what mine did." The city lights sparkled below them like stars, each light representing people who might one day benefit from the medical innovations they were creating. "You know," Marcus said with a slight smile, "Emma asks about you all the time. She tells everyone that her Aunt Diane is a superhero who saves kids. Diane laughed, remembering how Michael used to say the same thing. Maybe she's right. Maybe we all have a little superhero in us. Sometimes it just takes the right moment to remember how to fly. Standing on that balcony, Dr. Diane Mitchell, no longer invisible, no longer hiding, looked out at a future filled with possibilities she was finally ready to embrace. 1 year later, Diane still arrives at Hamilton Industries every morning at 7 a.m., but now she walks through the front lobby, where her portrait hangs alongside other company executives, her achievements cataloged for everyone to see. The transformation is complete, yet she remains grounded in the humility that her journey taught her. Every morning, she makes a point of greeting the custodial staff, the security guards, the cafeteria workers, people whose contributions keep the company running but often go unnoticed. She remembers what it felt like to be invisible, and she refuses to let anyone else experience that dismissal under her watch. Young medical professionals seek her guidance regularly, drawn by her unconventional path and remarkable innovations. Never let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by their perception, she tells them. Your value doesn't change based on whether others recognize it. Her pediatric seizure detection system has now prevented over 200 emergencies in schools nationwide. The emergency consultation platform serves 43 rural hospitals. The workplace medical protocols have been adopted by Fortune 500 companies across 12 industries. But perhaps most importantly, her story has become a beacon for others who have been overlooked or dismissed. Healthcare workers who changed careers due to burnout, immigrants whose medical degrees weren't recognized, women whose expertise was questioned because of their gender. All of them find inspiration in the physician who was invisible until the moment she chose to be seen. Emma Hamilton, now 9 years old, visits the office monthly. She's become the unofficial mascot of the Pediatric Medical Device Division, testing child-friendly interfaces and providing feedback with the serious demeanor of someone who understands the importance of the work. Dr. Diane, she said during her most recent visit, "My dad says you saved my life. But you did more than that. You saved his life too because I'm his whole world." The wisdom of a child often cuts straight to truth. Diane had saved more than Emma that night at the wedding. She had saved herself, Marcus's faith in recognizing hidden talent, and countless future patients who would benefit from medical innovations born from her unique perspective. Her story reminds us that brilliance doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Excellence doesn't always come dressed in expensive suits or decorated with prestigious titles. Sometimes the most capable person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. The server, the janitor, the assistant whose potential remains hidden behind society's assumptions about worth and status. The next time you encounter someone whose job seems beneath their intelligence, whose background doesn't match their wisdom, whose appearance contradicts their capabilities, remember Diane Mitchell. Remember that dismissing people based on their current circumstances means missing the extraordinary gifts they might bring to your world. Sometimes, the person who saves your life is the one you've spent years learning not to see. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones nobody sees coming, carrying stethoscopes in their purses and keeping medical knowledge alive in their hearts, waiting for the moment when their hidden talents are finally needed. What hidden talents are you overlooking in your own life? Share your thoughts below and remember, everyone deserves to be seen.